Here's our interview with Professor Declan Hill.
The quick thing about Canada is that this is an absolute freaking disaster. This is a protest that got out of, that was so badly mismanaged by the local Liberal Party, who are deeply corrupt. And along with corruption goes incompetence, as you know. So they were utterly unable to handle these guys. So they've lied. They've created a sophisticated public relations campaign to make these guys look like Nazis. It's outrageous what's happened. They suspended our civil liberty. And it really is, in my opinion, a dire warning for the rest of Western society, including Americans, because if they can do this to Canadians, they can certainly do it to you guys.
Yeah.
The suspension of our bank accounts. And by the way, just so that I'm completely clear, I'm not a right winger. As like yourself, as an independent journalist and thinker, I try to be completely, just the facts. But if I had to choose, I'd be a Bernie Sanders lefty progressive. That's how I was raised. So when I see those guys and I see those protests, I'm, they're not my people, but I'm like, I don't care. We got to defend these people's right to protest. So if necessary, I'm happy to come back and make that speech for you and talk to you about that. Because
what do you sense I haven't really seen polling in Canada, but have you seen polling, or if not, what do you sense is the view of most Canadians about
it's
Trudeau's
deeply
response?
Popular? And authoritarian regimes, authoritarian autocracy is always popular at the beginning. And so when Justin's dad, Pierre Trudeau, put in the War Measures Act back in the 1970s, I remember my parents saying, oh, it was like the most popular thing the guy did. It's always hugely popular, and particularly with the furor that my former colleagues at the CBC and the mainstream media in Canada have done, equating these guys with racist and white supremacists. I mean, one of the weirdest things, James, was that as I'm watching this, and as a Canadian exile, I'm just glued to the screen and watching everything I can. I'm watching these guys, and just for the short, quick thing to jump in with an American viewer or listener, they're kind of like the same demography as the Thin Blue Line supporters would be. So the same type of people who would go to a Thin Blue Line, support the police, slightly right-wing thing here in America, are kind of what those guys are in Canada. Not quite, but it's just for a quick shorthand thing. But as I'm listening to this, I'm hearing native Indigenous Indian drums and shouting and chanting. And sure enough, the camera turns back and you can see there are native drummers on the side of the protesters. So imagine the head spin for you as an American. There's a Thin Blue Line demonstration and the local Indigenous guys are coming out to support them. Like you'd be like, whoa, like those guys aren't the natural allies. Like what's going on here? And that's the seismic shift in Canadian politics. And this is why, part of the reason why the Liberal Party of Canada is cracking down in an utterly unprecedented way is because you're seeing these coalitions of unlikely groups really challenging the political orthodoxy up there.
And is this national emergency that he's declared, or martial law, or whatever the heck it is, when was the last time that was done in Canada?
It was done by his father, Pierre Trudeau, in 1970. And to be fair to the father and completely fair to the son, the two examples are completely, in 1970, there were kidnappings, there was violence on the street, there were bombings. The Front Libération de Québec, this Quebec independence movement was a violent terrorist organization that had kidnapped the British consul in Montreal, that was threatening people, that there were bombs going off. Now it's a bunch of unruly guys who haven't done any systematic violence. They haven't done, for example, in January 6th here in America, where they ran into the Congress and they ran around. They didn't do that. They stayed outside. They set up little hot tubs and bouncy castles for their kids. So this is an unprecedented disaster for civil liberties. They're now going after the money accounts of protesters in Canada and protesters' families.
Yeah, there's one story that Fox News reported that I just find hard to believe, but I guess it's true. But sometimes, networks can exaggerate things for effect, that this woman donates $50 to the cause, I don't know, through GoFundMe or whatever, and she's got a bank account frozen simply by the mere fact that she had donated money to the cause?
Look, I take your point about mainstream media, and you've clearly got a biased media. The Fox and the what we call rebel media up in Canada is going to report one side, and the other side is going to be mainstream. However, in general, Fox has got the right spirit about this particular story, and they have clearly identified a major peril to Western societies, the suspension of democracy and this constitutional stuff. It's deeply worrying. And hats off to Fox. I'm not always a big Fox supporter. I think sometimes they're too biased. But on this particular story, they've got it right. And that story of a woman donating $50 to the truckers' convoy, not actually taking part in the protest herself, but just sending them money, is indicative of the mass hysteria which is going on in my country. So there's a cafe in my neighborhood. James, as we began this conversation, I'm from the community. I'm from the neighborhood where those protests are. And my local coffee shop, where I go in and I do my little, I'm a quasi-European with my little handkerchief and, can I have a double espresso? And they're good. They're really nice gelato. Stella Luna, they won the competition for best gelato, Italian ice cream in Canada. They were sending money to the truckers' convoy. And then those contributions were hacked by somebody and spread out all over social media and mainstream media. And people in my community threatened them, said that we're going to break your windows, we're going to smash your restaurant down. We can't believe that you supported these truckers. So there's a mass reaction against the truckers by people who really should know better, including the governing Liberal Party, where they're reaching down to local coffee shops, to single moms who chip in $50, and they suspend all their accounts. So how she's going to take her kids to school, how she's going to provide money, to feed them, I don't know. But the government has very clearly said, we don't like people who don't support us. We don't like people who are going to protest against us. I'll give you one more example, which Fox has not reported on, to show you and your viewers the kind of hysteria that's going on. There's an excellent journalist up there called David Pugliese. He does fantastic work on military and defense contracts. I stand in respect for the man, normally. He has completely, like most of the mainstream media in my country, completely lost it. And he wrote an article about how soldiers and members of law enforcement were supporting the protesters. And the evidence that he brings to the table, one part of the evidence he brings to the table, is that a lot of people were discussing among the military why they were anti-vaccine and anti-government. And that's it. I mean, that is it. This is the, quote, existential threat that the mainstream media is reporting, that soldiers, the people who are going to, literally give their bodies for their country, are somehow, quote, ungovernment and unvaccinated. Or sorry, they're discussing anti-vaccine. They could still be vaccinated, but the idea they could have an opinion that wasn't with the government and wasn't with vaccine means that they are dangerous and they must be criminalized and kicked out of the military. It's shocking times. It really is the criminalization of political views and social views of a significant minority in Canada.
And they're mocking the term freedom, it seems. They're turning freedom into a bad word. You're some crazy nut job if you're talking about freedom.
Look, brother, it gets much, much worse than that. I wasn't watching this with great interest. It was like, oh, okay, another protest, fair enough, whatever, go on. And then I started reading the mainstream media from Canada that there were Nazi symbols on these guys' flags. And I was pretty shocked because I cannot overstate how unpopular Nazism is in Canada. On the left, on the right, we were on the beaches of D-Day. We remember that. We were fighting in that war since September 3rd, 1939. People remember that very, very clearly. And, you may have the occasional creep in his mom's basement who, loves dressing up in Waffen and SS uniforms. But for the rest of us, it's absolutely creepy. And so I was surprised at this. And I started seeing photos and my former colleagues in mainstream media reporting that these truckers had Nazi symbolism on it. So for the first few days, I was like, oh, this is a bit odd. But like yourself, James, I started inquiring. I started looking more and studying more closely. And I realized that they weren't actually Nazi symbols. They were equating Justin Trudeau, the prime minister, with Nazism. That was the, quote, Nazi symbolism that they were using. It was simply a protest. But that is the mainstream meme story that these guys are Nazis and stuff.
Well, it's not just the mainstream. It's Justin Trudeau's line. He's the one that keeps calling them Nazis. Thank you again to our guest, Professor Declan Hill. You can check out his podcast, Crime Waves, wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you to our producer, Michael Parker. Thank you all for listening. We'll be back soon with another episode of The Hidden Truth Show.
Thank you for listening to The Hidden Truth Show with Jim Breslow. You can find us at hiddentruthshow.com. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hidden Truth Show. Join us again next week for another episode of Hidden Truth Show with Jim Breslow.